everybody.
Good morning.
Al had a birthday. You know, Al, you and Charlene and Mary Lou and I have a lot in common. We both love yard work, right?
Yeah.
And we have a contest as to whether our deer can eat more of your food than our deer can eat more of ours. It's been going on. How are you all doing? Pretty good, Aaron. Well, I just want you to know, true story, everything I say is true, but this is even truer. I'm coming to Sunday school today. I'm driving in our subdivision, and I had to come to a halt because a deer ran across, and I thought of Val and Charlene. It's just great. Nancy Harper, I'm so glad you're here today, and I told you, I warned you ahead of time. I could not believe, I sat down to listen to your lesson, which was really fine, it really was. And you started reading the passage assignment for that day, and I perked up. I couldn't remember. Do you remember what you said in Isaiah, the 11th chapter, 1 through 9? A shoot shall come out from the stump of Jesse. A shoot shall come out from the stump of Jesse. Hope will come in the form of a new king. And I said, that's following. I'm going to follow up in her lesson right from when that happens. So I perked up. You told of this shoot coming out of the stump. Mary Lou and I can relate to that comparison. We love yard work, as I mentioned, and we know about shoots and stumps. But the lesson today is loaded with history, and one for me is a delight to teach. First, we're going to be in 1 Samuel, the 16th chapter, 4 through 13. And then we're going to jump over to one of the minor prophets, Micah, the 5th chapter, the 2nd verse, just one verse, but oh, that verse. So the lesson today is loaded. First, you need to know who was Samuel. Samuel was the earliest of the great Hebrew prophets after Moses, and he is the last judge of Israel. Samuel became a judge with a permanent leadership office, an office approaching that of a king. So we've got to realize they had a king. The king of Israel was there, and Samuel is second in line to the king. And he is very powerful. When he speaks, everybody listens. Now, class, why do you think, when the people clamored for a king like the surrounding nations had, Samuel was reluctant to grant their request? Do you remember that? They didn't have a king in Israel. They were doing fine. They were doing great. But all of a sudden, they looked around and they saw these other nations, they had kings. Well, we want a king. They've got a king. We want one. God spoke to Samuel and said, you really don't want them to have a king. And Samuel said they're insisting on it. So they got their first king, who was Saul. And we know about Saul. Saul had his problems. Why do you think Samuel was reluctant to grant that request to get a king? Anybody?
The king's going to tax you.
They would tax you. That's exactly right.
And then you're going to look to the king instead of to the Lord.
And exactly, and they knew, and God knew, they would start looking more to the king than they would to the Lord. And that happens in politics, as we know. Getting too cozy with surrounding nations and their style of living could result in intermarrying, intermingling, and all kind of unknown problems. Nevertheless, when Samuel did grant it, it turned out to be a very poor choice. The choice was a man named Saul. Saul, as first king, he had everything that you should have. He was handsome, he was likable, and he was tall. But he had a tragic flaw that ultimately led to his own ruin. False pride and extreme jealousy were his downfall. God speaks to Samuel and tells him that Saul needs to have a successor to the throne of Israel. Now, he's not saying we're going to kick Saul out. Saul will serve out the time that he's got. But we've got to have a successor to Saul. He's not going to be deposed, but simply replaced at Saul's death. Where are we today in today's lesson? Since Saul is rejected as king, Samuel is sent by the Lord to a little insignificant town called Bethlehem, to the house of a man named Jesse. 1 Samuel 16, chapter 4 through 13. Samuel did what the Lord commanded, and he came to Bethlehem. The elders of the city came to meet him trembling and said, "Do you come peaceably?" Hey, I want to stop here a minute. Class, do any of you know why the people of Bethlehem were in fear of Samuel? If you do, you really get a gold star. I had to search that up good.
Well, if he represented Saul, they probably were concerned.
Exactly, Nancy. He represented Saul, and he's coming into a little insignificant town called Bethlehem. And here is the guy that's second in command to the whole country, and he's coming in there, and they shiver. They say, "Oh my gosh, we must have done something wrong. We have done something wrong." And because the king's official never showed up in small villages unless there was trouble. Remember, Bethlehem is very small, very insignificant at this time. Bethlehem is just a small, insignificant town. But we're going to get some significance to it. The presence of an important man like Samuel could be dangerous and worrisome for the villagers. Verse 6, Samuel said, "I come peaceably, Jesse, to your home to sacrifice to the Lord. Sanctify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." And Samuel sanctified Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they came, Samuel looked at Eliab and said, "Surely the Lord's anointed is now before the Lord." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look on his appearance or the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance. But the Lord looks on the heart." Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. Excuse me. Samuel said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Then Jesse made Shammah pass by. And Samuel said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen any of these." Samuel said to Jesse, "Are all of your sons here?" And Jesse said, "Oh, there remains yet the youngest, but he's out keeping the sheep." And Samuel said to Jesse, "Send and bring him, for we will not sit down until he comes here." Jesse sent and brought him in. Now, he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes, and he was handsome. The Lord said, "Rise and anoint him, for this is the man." Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed David in the presence of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. Samuel then set out and went to Ramah. Okay, class, let's get some real dialogue here. I've got some questions to ask. Why do you think Jesse forgot about David out in the field with the flocks?
Out of sight, out of mind.
Out of sight, out of mind. So true, Janie. Out of sight, out of mind. He's out feeding, guarding the sheep. Anything else?
Was he the youngest? Was he the youngest?
He was the very youngest. And, we're a little different. We have 3 children, and we love all 3 of ours the same, but that was not all that true back in that time. You've got 7 or 8 children, you forgot about some, I don't know. But I'll tell you, it's even more significant. Animals prowl. David was staying out in the field, and it was very, very dangerous. Why? Well, I just told you. Animals prowl for the flocks, and protecting them was hazardous work. David probably only had a slingshot for protecting the sheep and himself. He didn't have a rifle. I had a slingshot when I was a kid, and I couldn't hit the side of a barn with it. I don't know. Any of y'all ever have one?
Oh, yeah.
Couldn't, oh yeah, oh yes. I couldn't hit the side of a barn. I had a BB gun, and that was great. But I don't think David's father cared much about him. I'll tell you why. He's the youngest. He's a kid. And he's out there in 24/7. He's prowling animals, and they could eat him up just as quick as they would eat one of his flock. So, the dad said, oh yeah, I've got another son. I really kind of forgot about it. He's out in the field, not that important. Our pastor, Dr. Head, said in his sermon last week that the status of shepherds was very low on the totem pole. You remember him saying that? Very low. Jesse may have had little regard for his son David. God told Samuel not to look on the sons being passed before him, thinking only on their appearance or height. God told Samuel not to do that because God, looks on the heart. He looks on the heart. As soon as David came into the house, God said to Samuel, "Rise and anoint him, for he is the one." Class, you and I have the opportunity of looking ahead many years, and we know that from the house of David will come Jesus Christ. Now let's progress to the one verse from the prophet Micah, one of the minor prophets. Why do I say he's a minor prophet?
Short book. Short book.
Short and sweet. And some people say, well, the major prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, they're more important than a minor prophet. It's not true. All of the prophets were extremely important to God, and they should be to us. Micah just was one of the minor prophets because he was short and sweet. But listen to this. Not at all. It simply means that their writings were shorter than the major prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, as I said. What they said is just as important. Here's the 5th chapter, just one verse, the 2nd chapter. "But you, O Bethlehem of Ephratah, who are one of the little clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to rule in Israel, whose origin is from old, from ancient days." Micah's statement comes around 250 years after David's anointing, when the mighty city of Jerusalem was on the verge of destruction by the Babylonians. Excuse me, folks. Micah spoke of this coming destruction, but then Micah tells the Israelites to look forward to a better day. In fact, he tells them that God will not abandon them forever, and that in the future, God will bring forth a new ruler who will redeem them. Incredibly, folks, this minor prophet is the only prophet who tells them that the child will be born in Bethlehem. He names Bethlehem, and he names it over 700 years before the birth of Christ. to make this even more astonishing, Mary and Joseph are not from Bethlehem. Where are they from? Nazareth. Yeah, they're not from Bethlehem. Odds are that the baby Jesus should have been born at home in Nazareth. But why were Mary and Joseph in Bethlehem? To pay their taxes, Ann. And Christopher, you're just so bright today. They had to leave Nazareth to go to Bethlehem. Incredibly, Micah says, hey, I'm telling you, this child is going to be born in Bethlehem. He names Bethlehem. So, and like you say, we know why did they have to go to Bethlehem? They had to pay their taxes, you're right. Any of you ever have to pay your taxes? It's a lot of fun, isn't it? Lord have mercy.
Well, how would you like to know you had to go to your hometown?
Yeah. I mean, my gosh, I'd have to go to Macon to pay my taxes. Can anything good come out? Well, I don't know. So, you know, odds are that the baby Jesus would have been born in Nazareth, but Mary and Joseph, they had to go to Bethlehem, and she is heavily laden. Heavily laden. And any of you ladies, can you relate to being heavily laden? And I certainly saw that. But they did have to go and pay their taxes, and this pregnant Mary delivered during her time there in Bethlehem. Micah may have been a minor prophet, but he surely gave you and me a major statement. And that really finishes up my lesson today. Any questions?
What a scary journey that must have been for Mary.
That is so true, Ann. They didn't have SUVs. They didn't have paved roads. They didn't have phones and all of that. And just having a baby at that time for a lady would have been hazardous. There's no telling how many people, they may have had 7 children and lost 12 or whatever, 3 or 4. But you're so right, it was such a hazardous road. And not only no SUVs and no paving, but people on the prowl there. People on the prowl. And they would, you know, it was very, very dangerous, but they had to pay their taxes. Anything else?
I'm glad you said that, people on the prowl, because I guess they were carrying money to pay their taxes. I never thought about that.
Yeah.
I had not thought of that. I had not thought of that, Janie. They certainly had money
Yeah.
because they're going to have to pay their taxes. You couldn't write a check then.
No.
You know,
Credit card.
and Bill says in credit cards. Oh, we know about those, don't we? Yes, my son Greg tried to get my credit card one time when he was little, and he was going to buy a puppy with it. So, anything else going on? It's so great being here with you folks today. I love to teach. I love being with you folks, and I love the Christmas season. Let's just close out, and I'll have a prayer for us. Dear Lord, how wonderful it is that out of a small, insignificant town like Bethlehem could come the birthplace of the house of David and on to the birth of Jesus. Great things come from small things. Thank you for all you do for us each and every day. We ask all of this in your wonderful name. Amen.